The House of Commons was cloaked in an eerie silence, the kind that preceded seismic moments in political history. Every MP sat frozen, every aide stiff in their seat, as Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the lectern. Even the journalists in the press gallery held their breath, pens hovering above notepads. Outside, Ottawa's iconic Parliament buildings were battered by a sharp wind, the snow slicing sideways against the Gothic stone like the prelude to a blizzard, nature reflecting the political storm about to be unleashed inside. Carney adjusted the microphone with deliberate calm, but his eyes were steely, focused. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of a nation on the brink. "My fellow Canadians," he began, his tone devoid of the usual party polish, stripped of soundbites and slogans. "We stand at a crossroads, a pivotal moment in our nation's history. What we do next will define us for a generation." He paused, not for effect, but for weight. The room leaned in. "Tonight," he said, his voice tightening with resolve, "I am asking the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and call an emergency snap election. An election not about petty politics or narrow policy debates, but about the very soul of Canada." Gasps rippled across the chamber like a wave. Snap elections in Canada were a constitutional mechanism seldom invoked with such gravity. Traditionally, they were tools of political advantage, called when a government sought to capitalize on favorable polling. But this felt like something else entirely, something historic, something bordering on existential. Carney's next words made it clear. "This election," he continued, locking eyes with the opposition, "is about confronting the significant threat posed by Donald Trump and his reckless tariff war." The name hit the chamber like a live wire. Trump. It echoed in the rafters, reverberating through the very architecture of the room. Cries of protest erupted from the conservative benches, with their leader, Pierre Dubois, springing to his feet, red-faced, shouting, "Outrageous! Fear-mongering! Irresponsible!" But Carney was undeterred. "For too long," he said, voice rising to meet the fury in the room, "we have stood by as Mr. Trump bullies our industries, slaps tariffs on our steel, our lumber, our automotive sector, threatens the jobs of hard-working Canadians, and undermines the very foundation of the North American partnership that generations of leaders have built." He turned toward the camera broadcasting live to homes across the nation, his message aimed not at MPs, but at millions of Canadians watching in disbelief. "We need a strong mandate, a united front. We must defend our sovereignty, protect our economy, and tell the world that Canada will not be intimidated. Not now, not ever." The message was unmistakable. Carney wasn't just seeking re-election, he was rallying the nation for a battle of values, of identities, of national pride. The April election wouldn't be fought over domestic squabbles like pipelines, daycare, or pharmacare. It would be a referendum on Trumpism itself, waged on Canadian soil. In a single speech, Carney had transformed the political landscape. The usual dividing lines blurred, partisan debates fell away. Canada's next election was now framed not as a matter of party, but of principle. And in doing so, Carney had drawn his line in the snow, a line between Canada and the shadow of its southern neighbors' disruptive politics, a line between sovereignty and submission, between deference and defiance. The campaign trail would be fierce, the rhetoric volcanic, and the stakes monumental. Mark Carney had lit the match. Now the country would burn with debate, division, and perhaps, for the first time in a generation, destiny. Across the border, inside the gilded confines of the Oval Office, Donald J. Trump watched Mark Carney's address unfold on a massive wall-mounted screen, the Canadian Prime Minister's stern face framed by a Canadian flag and a storm of rhetoric. Snow pelted Parliament Hill on the live feed, but here in Washington the air was warm, the tension hotter. Trump sat motionless, his expression unreadable, until the speech ended and he let out a scoff, leaning back in his chair with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Globalist clown," he muttered, reaching for the phone on his desk. "Get me Caroline and Miller. I want a plan. Now." Within minutes, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt and Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller swept into the room, both poised, alert, and already anticipating the tone of the meeting. They were more than just staffers. They were survivors of the last political war, hardened by the media maelstroms, investigations, and ideological battles that had defined the first Trump presidency. Now, back in the saddle, they were more focused and more dangerous than ever. Trump jabbed a finger toward the paused image of Carney frozen mid-speech. He's throwing down, calling an election to go after me. Me. Thinks if he shouts Trump loud enough, Canada forgets about their inflation, their energy crisis, their crime. He's playing the victim card, Caroline said, folding her arms, her tone clipped and clear. Casting himself as the principal defender of Canada, painting us as the big bad wolves from the South. Exactly, Miller said, his voice low and deliberate, like a fuse being lit. It's a distraction, a ploy, but we know what this really is. Carney, like Trudeau before him, is just another polished servant of the global elite, the kind of guy who gets invited to Davos, drinks champagne with IMF bankers, and lectures working people about dignity while outsourcing their jobs. He's not protecting Canada, he's protecting them, the same crowd that's been bleeding both our countries dry for decades through global trade deals, climate treaties, and bureaucratic corruption. Trump leaned forward, his fingers steepled. So, we hit back, but not just with tariffs or sound bites. We go bigger. This isn't just about NAFTA 2.0 or some speech. This is about the forgotten men and women on both sides of the border. I want Canadians and Americans to hear the truth. We're not the enemy. They are. The strategy took shape quickly. Reframe the narrative. Don't play defense. Go on the offensive. Carney wanted to make the election about Trump? Fine. Trump would make it about him. About elites versus populists, about workers versus Wall Street, about sovereignty versus submission. And he would draw a straight line from Carney to the World Economic Forum, to the architects of globalism, to the very forces Trump had promised to tear down since 2016. I want Hannity on this tonight, Trump snapped. He'll get the message out. This isn't just about tariffs. This is about foreign interference. Carney's using our name, our policies, to tilt an election. You think we'd get away with that in Ottawa? Caroline was already typing out talking points. Miller's eyes burned with intensity as he drafted language for the next day's press briefings. Trump's campaign team was alerted within the hour. Ads were drafted, influencers activated, and a primetime response was scheduled before the Canadian morning news cycle even resumed. Outside, the wind howled across the White House lawn, but inside the West Wing, a different kind of storm was brewing. Mark Carney had launched a war for Canada's soul. Now, Trump was opening the Northern Front. And this time, the battlefield stretched far beyond borders. That evening, as the clock struck 8 p.m. Eastern, Sean Hannity took to the air with the unmistakable energy of a man handed political red meat on a silver platter. Bathed in the polished glow of the Fox News studio, beneath a bold chyron that read, "Foreign Interference," Hannity wasted no time. The opening montage featured carefully selected clips from Mark Carney's fiery speech, intercut with flashing headlines about tariffs, border tensions, and clips of factory closures. Images meant to hit working-class viewers like a punch to the gut. "Folks," Hannity thundered, leaning toward the camera as if delivering a sermon to a nation on edge, "let's be very clear about what we're witnessing here. This is not about trade. This is not about diplomacy. This is about a foreign leader, a globalist bureaucrat dressed up as a prime minister, trying to dictate American policy from the podium of a foreign parliament." The studio audience, mic'd just enough to pick up their reactions, murmured and gasped on cue. Hannity's voice sharpened, rising to a crescendo. Mark Carney is nothing more than a globalist stooge, funded by Soros, cheered on by the radical left, and now, trying to undermine our president and destroy your economy. He doesn't speak for Canadians. He speaks for the bankers, the bureaucrats, the Davos crowd who've been shipping your jobs to China for decades. Within minutes, the Fox News phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. Callers from Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio flooded in, voicing their support for Trump, their fury at Carney, and their long-simmering suspicion that so-called allies were anything but. Twitter and Truth Social exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Carney the Clown, hashtag Northern Interference, America First. In Carney, Trump world had found its perfect foil. A polished, internationally adored liberal technocrat with a history at the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. And in one speech, Carney had volunteered himself as the villain in a populist narrative he never understood, and certainly couldn't control. Meanwhile, just across the northern border, Justin Trudeau was quietly working the back channels. Though no longer the frontman for Canada's Liberal Party, his influence behind the scenes remained considerable. Concerned by the blowback against Carney's bold gamble, Trudeau moved quickly to shore up support. He made late-night calls to his old allies in Brussels and Berlin, urging them to issue public statements condemning Trump's protectionism and affirming the shared values of multilateral trade and liberal democracy. Within 48 hours, op-eds appeared in Le Monde, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel, warning of American economic aggression and calling Carney a brave defender of the post-war order. But even Trudeau knew the real battle wasn't in the halls of European power. It was in the homes of everyday Canadians. There, too, the tide was shifting, because Trump wasn't playing by the old rules. He didn't rely on diplomats or filtered press briefings. He spoke directly to Canadians. Through social media videos, town hall live streams, and unexpected interviews on populist Canadian radio shows, Trump bypassed the establishment and reached across the border with a message of working-class solidarity. "You know who gets hurt by these trade deals?" he asked in one viral clip. "It's not the politicians, it's not the bankers, it's the auto worker in Windsor, it's the steel worker in Hamilton. They sold you out just like they sold out our people." It was electric. Even some Canadian voters, long skeptical of Trump's bombast, began to listen, not because they loved him, but because what he said resonated. They too had seen plants close. They too had felt forgotten. And now, with Carney's rhetoric veering toward nationalism dressed as technocracy, they weren't sure who was really on their side. The Northern Front was open, but this wasn't a war of armies. It was a war of narratives. And Trump, with his unique instinct for message warfare, was beginning to win it. Carney had tried to make Trump the villain of a Canadian election. Now, Trump was on track to become its most unexpected protagonist. Recognizing the evolving dynamics north of the border, Trump's inner circle acted with characteristic stealth and precision. They knew Carney had overplayed his hand, and now the real opportunity lay not in confrontation, but in division. Beneath Canada's polite federalist surface, fault lines had long existed between Ottawa and the provinces, particularly in regions where economic dependency on resource exports had clashed with central government policies. Trump's team zeroed in on these tensions like seasoned strategists. Without fanfare or press, emissaries from the White House began establishing quiet lines of communication with premiers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and even parts of Atlantic Canada. Leaders who had grown weary of Ottawa's top-down mandates and Carney's technocratic tone. Trump's message to them was subtle but unmistakable. "We're not your enemies. Ottawa is." He promised greater provincial input in future cross-border economic negotiations, hinting at the possibility of bilateral energy and trade deals that bypass the federal bottleneck. For provinces whose industries were dependent on U.S. markets, it was an irresistible offer. At the same time, back-channel contacts were opened with key power brokers in Canada's Conservative Party. While officially staying neutral, Trump's team dropped hints of future cooperation, common-sense trade reform, worker-first economic policy, and, most importantly, shared opposition to globalist overreach. To the Conservatives, still licking their wounds from electoral defeats and a struggling leadership narrative, Trump's overtures weren't threats, they were lifelines. Meanwhile, Trump's public rhetoric struck a very different chord than the caricature painted by Carney's campaign. "I'm not against Canada," Trump said during a Fox News interview watched by millions on both sides of the border. "I love Canada. I love the people, but we've had some very bad deals. All I want is fair trade, a deal that helps American workers and helps Canadian workers too. We can win together." It was classic Trump, blunt, populist, disarming, and it resonated. In towns across Ontario, Quebec, and the prairies, where economic frustration had long simmered under the surface, the message struck a nerve. Carney's lofty appeals to liberal order and multilateralism sounded increasingly detached, even condescending. Trump, once painted as the villain of the Canadian election, was now being recast in living rooms and coffee shops as something else entirely: a pragmatist, a deal-maker, maybe even, however reluctantly, a voice of reason. And then came the bombshell. A right-leaning Canadian website, True North Dispatch, published a trove of leaked internal communications from Carney's campaign. The documents were damning. They revealed extensive coordination with former Trudeau-era strategists, foreign consultants tied to European lobbying firms, and think tanks funded by international donors. Internal emails laid out a strategy to leverage anti-Trump sentiment to unify the base and pressure U.S. swing states via Canadian media engagement. One particularly egregious memo discussed seeding op-eds in American outlets to discredit Trump's trade rhetoric ahead of the U.S. midterms, essentially a blueprint for foreign influence operations. The backlash was immediate and explosive. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. Carney, once the polished guardian of Canadian sovereignty, now stood accused of orchestrating foreign interference in another country's political system. His high-minded campaign had been reduced to a spectacle of hypocrisy. Critics on both the left and right pounced. Headlines blared, "Carneygate" and "Trudeau Network Exposed." Editorials called for investigations. Conservative MPs demanded a parliamentary inquiry. Social media erupted with comparisons to the scandals that had plagued Trudeau's final term: SNC-Lavalin, WE Charity, and now Carney was seen as just another figure in a web of elite manipulation. The trust he had so carefully cultivated was gone. The wound reopened from the Trudeau years. Elitism, corruption, international entanglements began bleeding again, and the people remembered how their voices had been drowned out by downtown consultants and global summits. Now, that discontent had found a new outlet. And Trump, with impeccable timing, was standing on the other side of the border, not with threats, but with a handshake. The ground had shifted. The Northern Front was no longer just a campaign narrative. It was the battleground of legitimacy. And Carney had just lost his footing. The political earthquake unleashed by the leak rocked Canada's electoral landscape to its core. Almost overnight, the polls underwent a dramatic reversal. What had once been a comfortable lead for Mark Carney's Liberal coalition began to evaporate as the scandal seeped into every headline, news feed, and nightly broadcast. The public, already uneasy with Carney's technocratic demeanor and his overt hostility toward Trump, now viewed him not as a principled statesman, but as a calculating figure caught red-handed in the very kind of elitist backroom dealings he had sworn to rise above. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party, long dismissed as rudderless and reactionary, found itself suddenly reborn. Energized by the revelations and emboldened by Trump's subtle but unmistakable gestures of support, the Tories surged forward in a unified offensive. Pierre Dubois, the party's young, firebrand leader, wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. With a sharpened message and a newfound momentum, Dubois transformed his campaign into a crusade, not just against Carney, but against the very establishment that had sustained him. During a nationally televised debate watched by millions, Dubois seized the moment with the clarity and force of a man who knew history was within reach. "Mr. Carney promised us strength," Dubois said, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "He promised transparency. He promised unity. But what has he delivered? Division, distrust, and deception. He tried to use America, our greatest ally, as a scapegoat for his own political failures. He used this election not to unite Canada, but to save his career." The words landed like a thunderclap. The audience didn't applaud. They absorbed. Carney, standing across the stage, looked diminished. Gone was the assured banker-turned-leader who had once exuded competence and control. In his place stood a man visibly rattled, struggling to pivot back to the narrative he had spent weeks constructing. But the moment was gone. The cracks were too deep. His rebuttals, once crisp and cool, now rang hollow, defensive, even desperate. The coordinated media campaign, the foreign endorsements, the elite backers, everything Carney had once framed as a strength had become political quicksand. The snap election, called in a moment of supreme confidence to consolidate power and crush opposition, was rapidly becoming a spectacular miscalculation. The very act of calling the vote was now seen as an act of hubris, and every new development added weight to the perception that Carney had gambled the nation's stability for his own ambition. In towns across Ontario, Quebec, and the West, longtime Liberal voters began to whisper what had once been unthinkable. Maybe it was time for a change. Maybe Dubois, young, aggressive, unapologetically populist, wasn't the risk. Maybe Carney was. And so, with each passing day, each fiery speech from Dubois, each poll that ticked higher for the Conservatives, the path forward became clearer. Carney had tried to turn a foreign leader into a villain, but now, with Trump looming large over the border and Dubois hammering him at home, it was he who had become the villain in the eyes of many Canadians. The empire he had so meticulously constructed was crumbling, and all he could do was watch as the tide swept it away. Election night unfolded like a political landslide, the kind that reshapes not just governments, but eras. The Liberal Party, once the dominant force in Canadian politics and the standard-bearer of technocratic globalism, was decimated. Riding a wave of discontent, fueled by scandal, fatigue, and a nation's yearning for authenticity, the Conservative Party surged to victory in every province but a few urban strongholds. It wasn't just a win, it was a realignment. From the Atlantic coast to the prairies, voters sent a clear message. The Carney experiment had failed, and the Trudeau legacy had run its course. The numbers told the story. Liberal strongholds fell one after another, some by razor-thin margins, others in stunning landslides. Ridings that hadn't voted Conservative in decades turned blue. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, Conservatives posted record-breaking margins. In Ontario and British Columbia, key swing ridings swung hard to the right. Even in parts of Quebec, long thought impenetrable by national Conservatives, Dubois found unexpected inroads, propelled by a new generation of candidates and a message that resonated far beyond partisanship. At Conservative Party headquarters, the energy was electric. Supporters waved flags, chanted Dubois's name, and celebrated what they knew would go down as one of the most consequential elections in Canadian history. Cameras panned to Pierre Dubois as he took the stage, flanked by his team, beaming with the energy of vindication. "The Canadian people have spoken," Dubois declared, his voice booming across the jubilant crowd and into millions of homes. "They have chosen a new path, a path of cooperation, of prosperity, and of mutual respect. We will work hand in hand with our American allies, not to surrender our sovereignty, but to strengthen it. Together, we will build a stronger, more secure, and more united future for both of our great nations." It was a carefully crafted message, one that reflected both the reality of the campaign and the pragmatism of the new government. Dubois wasn't pledging allegiance to Trump, but he was acknowledging the undeniable shift in the geopolitical winds. Trump's tough trade stance, once feared, had now been reframed, even in Canada, as necessary, even beneficial. Carney's warnings had sounded out of touch, condescending, and ultimately hollow. Across town, the mood at Liberal headquarters was somber, almost surreal. Mark Carney stood at the podium, his face lined with exhaustion and unmistakable defeat. Behind him, rows of advisors and former Trudeau-era veterans stood in silence, their expressions unreadable. "Tonight, I offer my resignation as leader of the Liberal Party," Carney said quietly, the weight of his miscalculation hanging in the air. "I accept the judgment of the Canadian people. Though this was not the outcome we had hoped for, I remain proud of the values we stood for. I wish Mr. Dubois success in leading our country forward." But beneath the calm exterior, the failure was evident. Carney had gambled everything: his reputation, his party's future, and the stability of Canadian politics, on a campaign built around opposing Donald Trump. He had tried to make the American president a villain on Canadian soil. But in doing so, he had turned his back on economic anxieties, regional tensions, and the public's growing distrust of institutional elites. He had underestimated Trump. Worse, he had overestimated himself. And in the end, the Canadian people had delivered a stunning verdict. A new era had begun, one defined not by ideological conformity or global consensus, but by sovereignty, strength, and a reimagined relationship with America. The Trudeau-Carney era was over. The Dubois era, brash, unapologetic, and rooted in realism, had just begun. The following morning, under the soft golden light streaming through the windows of the Oval Office, President Donald Trump addressed the nation, and, more importantly, the world. The chaos of the campaign, the storm of rhetoric, scandal, and political warfare that had engulfed both sides of the U.S.-Canada border had given way to a moment of decisive calm. Trump, seated at the resolute desk, flanked by American and Canadian flags, spoke with a tone that surprised even his critics, one of clarity, control, and measured strength. "I want to congratulate Mr. Dubois on his victory," Trump said, his voice steady, his posture commanding. "It was a tremendous campaign, and I look forward to working with him to strengthen the historic ties between the United States and Canada." He paused, not for effect, but for impact, and then leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing with unmistakable intensity. "We don't want to dominate our allies," he continued. "We just want to stop being taken advantage of. And today the people of Canada said they're ready to stand on equal ground. That's all we've ever asked for. Fairness, respect, a level playing field. And now, for the first time in a long time, we've got a partner who gets it. And the message was unmistakable. The age of lopsided trade deals, deference to global institutions, and performative diplomacy was over. America was no longer asking, it was demanding a new paradigm. And now, with Dubois in Ottawa, that vision finally had a counterpart. Behind Trump stood Caroline Leavitt and Stephen Miller, stone-faced but inwardly glowing with vindication. They had been the architects of this moment, weaving together narrative, policy, and perception into a political masterstroke. What began as a defensive counter to Mark Carney's challenge had evolved into a geopolitical triumph. Trump hadn't just won a media battle, he had redefined the conversation around North American cooperation and sovereignty. As the cameras faded and the broadcast ended, Trump turned to them, the corners of his mouth curling upward into a rare, quiet smile. "We showed them," he said, voice lower now, more personal. "We showed them that the people, when they're given the truth, will always choose what's right." He wasn't just talking about Americans. He was talking about Canadians, about the steelworkers in Sarnia, the loggers in British Columbia, the entrepreneurs in Alberta, and the farmers in Saskatchewan, who had long felt abandoned by Ottawa's elite class. For years, they had been told that Trump was the villain. And yet, when given a choice between polished platitudes and unapologetic pragmatism, they had chosen substance. The Northern Front had been brutal. It had been fought not with weapons, but with words, tariffs, information warfare, and raw political force. It had tested alliances, strained institutions, and upended conventional wisdom. But in the end, it was the voice of the people that cut through the noise. As the sun rose higher over the Capitol Dome and Parliament Hill, a new chapter in the U.S.-Canada relationship began. Not forged in polite diplomacy, but in hard-won honesty, a relationship rooted in mutual respect, national interest, and a shared desire for prosperity that honored both sovereignty and strength. And as Trump stood from the resolute desk and straightened his jacket, there was no need for further comment. The battle was over, and America had once again rewritten the rules.